was a part of his life, a piece of his world, yet somehow I became nothing more than a fragment of his cruelty. Every day I gave him my love, my trust, my soul, and every day he turned it into pain. I remember the first time he hurt me without even touching me, his words, sharp as knives, cutting through the heart I had placed in his hands so blindly. I cried that night alone, my tears soaking into the sheets, my lips trembling with unspoken words, while he lay next to me, smiling, peaceful, as if nothing had happened, as if my brokenness was invisible. That smile haunted me, that careless grin that spoke of power, control, and arrogance, while I sank deeper into despair. I tried to speak, tried to tell him, tried to show him my agony, but he laughed. He mocked me softly at first, a cruel whisper. "You're too emotional, too fragile, too sensitive." Then the mockery grew louder, more public, until I felt like a fool trapped in a cage of my own love for him. My friends noticed the change, their eyes filled with worry, their voices trembling as they begged me to leave. But I stayed, believing that love meant enduring, that patience was strength, that maybe one day he would see me for what I truly was. But each day proved me wrong. Each night became a test of endurance, a trial of silence, and a theater of pain. He knew exactly how to wound me without leaving a mark, how to make my heart bleed without ever touching me. He ignored my happiness, celebrated my failures, and found joy in my quiet suffering. I remember the times I tried to smile, to hide the bruises of my heart, to pretend that everything was fine. He noticed, of course, he always did. And he would strike again, not with hands, but with words, with disdain, with deliberate coldness that froze the warmth in my chest. Yet I kept hopping. I kept telling myself, tomorrow will be better. Maybe tomorrow he will change. Maybe tomorrow he will love me like I deserve. But tomorrow never came. Instead, there were more silent dinners, more nights of lonely tears, more mornings where his eyes met mine with judgment, with pride, with the cruel certainty that I existed only for him to dominate. I remember the arguments, the ones I could not win, because my voice was always too small, too weak, too scared. And yet, every small act of his cruelty became a spark inside me, a seed of fire that I didn't understand at first. Each insult, each neglect, each manipulation, each quiet betrayal planted in me a strength I was unaware of, a power that slept while I suffered, a resolve that grew with every tear I shed. I remember the nights I whispered to myself, "I am stronger than this, I will survive," while my body shook, my soul screamed, and my heart ached. I remember staring at the ceiling, wondering why I had fallen in love with a man who only knew how to hurt me, wondering if I was foolish, broken, too weak to leave, too trapped in the illusion of his charm. But the truth was that my pain was molding me, sharpening me, turning me into someone who would not be silent forever. Each night of tears, each moment of fear, each second of waiting in agony was shaping a woman who would one day rise from the ashes of his cruelty and claim what was hers. And tonight is different. Tonight, I refuse to let him control the narrative. Tonight, I refuse to let fear dictate my words. Tonight, I am speaking. For the first time, I am letting my voice cut through the silence, letting the truth roar, letting the account of every cruelty, every manipulation, every moment of pain he caused come crashing down. He thinks I am fragile. He thinks I will break again. He thinks I will remain silent. But he is wrong. I am not the same girl who cried herself to sleep while he smiled beside me. I am the girl whose silence has grown into a storm, whose patience has turned into a plan, whose tears have fueled a fire of reckoning. The nights of betrayal, the days of humiliation, the moments of despair, they are all recorded in my heart, catalogued in my soul, and they will not be forgotten. He will face them all, and the woman he tried to break will be the one standing when the ashes settle. Tonight, I am no longer afraid, no longer weak, no longer a shadow in his world. I am the storm he never saw coming. I am the voice he silenced for too long. I am the reckoning, the truth, the fury of every tear he forced me to shed. And when the time comes, he will remember me, not as the girl who loved him, but as the woman who rose from his cruelty stronger, fiercer, unshakable, and unstoppable. The mornings were the worst. The sun would rise, but I felt as if I was buried in darkness, suffocating beneath the weight of his indifference. Every time I woke up, I felt the ghost of his smile lingering on my skin, mocking me for being alive, mocking me for hoping that love could exist where cruelty reigned. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing, and wonder how someone could sleep so peacefully while I felt like my heart was bleeding in silence. My days were a series of calculated torments. He would notice the smallest sign of my exhaustion, my trembling hands, my nervous laugh, and use it as evidence of my fragility. "You're too weak," he would say, his words sharp as knives, his gaze cold as ice. And I would nod silently, swallowing the pain, pretending I was fine, pretending I was the woman he wanted me to be. But inside, a storm was raging, a tempest of fear, anger, hurt, and defiance. Every harsh word, every neglectful glance, every moment of humiliation fueled the fire I didn't yet understand. I began to see the patterns in his cruelty, the way he thrived on my silence, the way he believed that breaking me would make him stronger. And slowly, I realized that I had been training him to underestimate me, that every tear, every silent plea, every moment of pretending to be small was preparing me for this moment of reckoning that I had yet to voice. I remembered the nights I would secretly write in my journal, words spilling out of me like lifeblood, documenting every instance of his arrogance, every instance of betrayal, every wound he inflicted upon my soul. I read those words now, and I see the strength that was always there, hidden beneath the layers of hurt and fear. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I would remain silent forever. He thought that my love made me weak, that my patience made me fragile, that my tears made me powerless. But he was wrong. Every instance of cruelty was a brick in the foundation of my resolve. Every insult became a spark of clarity. Every sleepless night of despair became a rehearsal for the courage I would one day wield like a sword. I can still recall the dinners where he ignored me completely, talking to friends and colleagues as if I were invisible, and yet his smirk would glance at me now and then, a silent reminder that he believed he had won. I remember the moments when I tried to confront him, my voice quivering, my heart in my throat, only for him to twist my words, laugh at my vulnerability, and leave me feeling smaller, weaker, invisible. But invisibility gave me power. Silence gave me strategy. Pain gave me clarity. I began to understand that his cruelty was not my weakness, it was my teacher. It showed me how to endure, how to observe, how to plan, and how to rise. The turning point came one evening when he dismissed me completely during a gathering of friends. I had tried to speak, tried to smile, tried to assert myself, but he cut me off with a laugh that echoed through my very bones. That night I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not plead. I sat alone in the darkness and whispered to myself, "No more. No more will I let him define my worth. No more will I allow him to believe he controls me. I will rise, I will speak, and he will pay for every moment he ever hurt me." That night, a part of me awakened, a part that had been dormant through all the pain, fear, and humiliation. It was the part that knew the storm was coming, the part that understood that love was never meant to hurt, and that cruelty was never meant to dominate. I began to notice the cracks in his arrogance, the ways in which he was careless, the ways in which he underestimated me. Every glance, every word, every action became a clue, a key, a sign that his empire of cruelty was not unbreakable. And as I watched him, smiling at the world while destroying my soul, I realized that his greatest mistake was believing that I was broken beyond repair. I was not broken. I was being forged. And the day would come when the pain he inflicted would become the instrument of his reckoning. I would no longer be the girl who cried silently at night. I would be the woman whose silence was a warning, whose tears had turned into power, whose voice would shake the very foundation of the life he thought he owned. He had controlled me, belittled me, humiliated me, and dismissed me for years, but he had never truly seen me. And when he finally did, it would be too late. By then, I would have transformed, and he would witness the full force of every tear, every wound, every moment of pain he thought was insignificant. I was readying myself for the day when I would no longer be a shadow in his world, but a storm he could not escape. And that day, he would remember every detail of his cruelty, every instance of his arrogance, and every moment he believed I would remain powerless. He would finally understand that the woman he tried to break had always been capable of rising, of confronting, of taking everything back that was stolen from her. The woman he underestimated had grown stronger in silence, sharper in patience, fiercer in her resolve, and unstoppable in her determination. And the night before that reckoning, I would sit quietly, my heart steady, my mind clear, and remember every single moment he ever hurt me, not with bitterness but with clarity, knowing that the world would soon witness his fall, and I would finally speak, finally act, and finally claim my justice. He never realized that my silence was not submission. He never understood that every tear I shed, every night I spent crying into my pillow, was not weakness but preparation. Every heartache he inflicted, every humiliation, every mocking smile became a lesson etched deep into my soul. I remember the countless moments I tried to fight back, only to be silenced by his arrogance, only to be reminded that my words meant nothing to him. Yet with every dismissal, I grew sharper, more aware, more determined. I learned to watch him, to study him, to understand the patterns of his cruelty. I noticed the little things, the way his voice hardened when he was angry, the way his eyes narrowed when he felt challenged, the way he underestimated everyone, especially me. He thought his charm would protect him, that his world of manipulation was untouchable, but every misstep he made was recorded in my mind, every flaw catalogued, every lie memorized. I started writing secretly, documenting every insult, every act of neglect, every betrayal like evidence building a case against him. I wrote about the nights I spent alone, shivering under his shadow, the days when I felt invisible in my own life, the moments when I believed love could justify cruelty. I wrote about the fear that gripped me, the anger that simmered beneath the surface, and the tiny sparks of rebellion I felt but could not yet ignite. Those journals became my sanctuary, my strategy, my map to freedom. I realized that surviving him was not just about enduring. It was about learning, about gathering strength, about preparing for the day when I would no longer be prey but predator. I could see how he underestimated me at every turn, how he believed my tears meant defeat, my silence meant weakness, my love meant obedience. But he did not know that within me, a storm was quietly forming. Every insult, every dismissal, every manipulation was fueling that storm, turning my pain into power, my sorrow into strategy, my fear into determination. I began to imagine the day I would confront him, the moment I would reveal all that I had endured, the day he would see the full weight of his actions reflected back at him. I envisioned the look on his face, the disbelief, the fear, the understanding that he had underestimated me all along. My mind became a battlefield where I rehearsed my rise, where I planned my steps, where I sharpened my words to strike with precision. He had believed that controlling me meant controlling my mind, my heart, my will. But he never knew that his cruelty was planting the seeds of my liberation, that every wound was a lesson, every tear a weapon, every night a training ground for my inevitable emergence. I remembered the times I pretended to sleep while he celebrated his arrogance, times I swallowed my pride while he gloated, times I smiled while my heart bled. All of it had meaning now. All of it had purpose. I had become a student of his cruelty, a scholar of manipulation, a warrior in disguise. And the world outside our home was beginning to notice his arrogance too. Friends whispered behind his back, colleagues commented on his temper, strangers felt the coldness in his presence. But none of them knew the depths of his cruelty, the countless hours he had spent eroding my spirit, the quiet suffering he thought no one would ever see. And that made me the only one who could deliver justice, the only one capable of showing him the consequences of his actions. I began small, testing him, observing his reactions, planting little seeds of doubt, little moments of defiance, just to see how far I could push, just to feel the strength returning to me. Each successful act, each moment of silent rebellion, filled me with confidence, fueled my resolve, and confirmed that I was not powerless. I was awakening, and with every passing day, the woman he thought he could control was becoming unstoppable. I remembered the nights I stared at the ceiling, whispering to the darkness, promising myself that I would rise, promising myself that I would not break, promising myself that he would pay for every tear he forced from me. And now, I knew that the day of reckoning was approaching. I could feel it in my bones, in my heartbeat, in the quiet intensity of my thoughts. He had never seen it coming, had never prepared for it, had never imagined that the girl he broke could become a force beyond his understanding. The fire that had been smoldering in me for years was ready to ignite, to engulf, to consume every trace of his arrogance, every lie, every cruel word, every moment of pain he had inflicted. And when that day came, there would be no mercy, no excuses, no turning back. He would face everything he had done, every shadow of his cruelty reflected back with the force of all the nights I cried, all the tears I swallowed, all the pain I endured. I was ready. I was patient. I was unstoppable. and he had no idea. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, like the first tremor before a storm announces itself. He didn't notice it at first, the small changes in my gaze, the steadiness in my voice, the way I no longer flinched when he walked into the room. I had spent years shrinking, years folding myself into the smallest shape possible just to fit into the spaces he allowed me. But now I found myself unfolding, stretching, reclaiming the air I once feared to breathe. He still spoke with the same arrogance, still threw his words like daggers, but now each blade only sharpened my resolve. I watched him more closely than ever, not with fear but with clarity. I saw how predictable he was, how fragile his ego looked beneath the surface, how desperately he needed control. And the more I studied him, the more I realized that the power he thought he held over me had never truly belonged to him. It had always been mine. I had just forgotten how to use it. The first true moment of change came on an afternoon when he accused me of something ridiculous, expecting the same old reaction. My silence, my tears, my trembling voice. But I stayed still, my expression empty, my eyes steady as I looked at him. For the first time, he saw something unfamiliar in me, something that unsettled him. His voice faltered for a second, a tiny fragment of confusion flashing across his face. That tiny flicker was everything. It showed me the first crack in his armor, the first sign that he wasn't unbreakable. I stopped reacting the way he expected. I stopped chasing him with apologies, stopped explaining myself, stopped softening my voice to keep the peace. The more indifferent I became, the more desperate he grew to provoke a response. And his desperation was my confirmation that the power dynamic had already begun to shift. I realized then how much he relied on my silence, my fear, my emotional submission. Without it, he felt unsteady, off balance, insecure. For the first time, I felt a quiet thrill, a rising strength that warmed every part of me. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't small anymore. I wasn't his victim anymore. I was transforming, and the transformation was unstoppable. I started setting tiny boundaries he didn't recognize at first, answering him calmly instead of emotionally, walking away when his voice rose, refusing to let his anger dictate the atmosphere of the room. Each small act of defiance confused him, irritated him, pushed him further into the corner of his own crumbling ego. I could see the frustration tightening his jaw, the disbelief darkening his eyes. He asked me once, "What's wrong with you?" And I almost laughed at the irony of the question. What was wrong with me? Everything he had broken was healing. Everything he had silenced was awakening. Everything he had crushed was rising again. The woman he had tried to tame was slipping out of his grasp. He didn't know how to handle a version of me that no longer feared him. And while he grew more agitated, I grew more steady. He tried new methods of control, sweetness disguised as concern, manipulation disguised as apology, anger disguised as love, but none of it could penetrate the fire I carried within me now. I had spent too many nights drowning in heartbreak to ever let myself fall back into those depths. I observed him now not as the man I once loved, but as the obstacle I was preparing to overcome. The more his facade cracked, the clearer it became that he was terrified, not of losing me, but of losing the dominance he believed was his right. I could feel the moment approaching, the one I had been preparing for since the first tear he ignored, the first cruelty he dismissed. The day was coming when the balance would tip completely, when my voice would rise loud enough to shake the walls that had confined me for years. I knew the confrontation was inevitable. And when it arrived, it wouldn't be with screams or chaos. It would be with truth, sharp, undeniable, unstoppable. I had waited too long, endured too much, lost too many pieces of myself to let the moment pass quietly. My heart wasn't afraid anymore. My hands didn't tremble. My voice didn't break. The reckoning was near, and I could feel it in every heartbeat, every breath, every step I took toward reclaiming my life. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him now was not the same woman he had once controlled. He didn't recognize the strength in my eyes, the certainty in my silence, the storm gathering behind my calm. But he would. Soon, very soon. And when he finally saw the truth, when he realized what I had become, it would be the beginning of his downfall. The days grew longer, and so did my patience, but this patience was no longer born of fear. It was calculated, deliberate, precise. Every word he spoke, every glance he cast, every manipulation he attempted became a step in my plan, a piece of the puzzle that I was assembling silently, invisibly, while he believed he still held control. He walked through life thinking I was fragile, thinking my tears had weakened me, thinking my silence was my submission. but each tear had been a rehearsal, each moment of quiet a strategy, each pang of heartbreak a sharpening of my instincts. I had learned to move like a shadow, to observe without being noticed, to understand without revealing, to anticipate every tactic he would use to maintain his dominance. And in that understanding, I found power. I found freedom. I found clarity. The more he tried to provoke me, the more he attempted to control me, the more he revealed the cracks in his own armor. I began to see how dependent he was on my compliance, how fragile his arrogance truly was, how little he could withstand when the person he thought he owned refused to yield. I started setting small traps, testing boundaries, observing reactions. His frustration grew, his smirk faltered. His voice occasionally betrayed a hint of desperation he had never known. I had never seen him like this, not because he had changed, but because I had changed. I was no longer the girl who crumbled under his gaze, no longer the woman whose heart he could crush with a single word. I was becoming the storm, the reckoning, the force he had never anticipated. And the more I observed him, the more I understood that his arrogance was his weakness, that his control was a facade, that his cruelty was nothing more than an armor that would shatter when faced with the truth. I began to plan carefully, intentionally, silently. Every move I made, every word I chose, every gesture I allowed was a step closer to the moment when he would see me, not as a fragile shadow, not as a soft target, but as a force he could not evade. He was meticulous, but so was I. Only my meticulousness had a purpose, a direction, an inevitable outcome. I began to gather evidence of everything, from the smallest insult to the grandest betrayal, documenting it in ways that could never be denied. I recorded conversations in my mind, memorized details, stored every slight, every humiliation, every cruel manipulation like weapons for the day they would be needed. I rehearsed the confrontation endlessly in my mind, imagining his disbelief, his fear, his inability to comprehend that I had never truly been broken. The woman he believed he had dominated had been hiding in plain sight, absorbing, enduring, strategizing, and now she was ready. I could feel the power in my own heartbeat, the certainty in my own voice, the strength in my own hands. He would soon discover that the cruelty he wielded as a weapon against me had only made me stronger, sharper, unstoppable. And the moment of reckoning did not arrive quietly. It began with a confrontation he could not control, a truth I could no longer contain. I spoke, not with trembling lips, not with hesitant words, but with clarity, with precision, with the quiet fury of someone who had endured every cruelty and refused to remain silent. His arrogance faltered as the words hit, his smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic he had never experienced. He realized, too late, that I was not the person he had hurt. I was the person he had created in his own underestimation. And as he struggled to maintain the illusion of control, I continued, laying bare every act of cruelty, every moment of suffering, every scar his arrogance had left behind. I spoke for the nights he ignored me, for the days he humiliated me, for the tears he thought would disappear unnoticed. I spoke for the girl who had cried alone, who had trembled under his gaze, who had endured silently while he believed he owned her soul. And with each word, the power shifted further, sliding inexorably into my hands. I could see him faltering, unable to respond, trapped in the mirror of his own cruelty. Every plan he had made, every manipulation, every deceit, collapsed under the weight of my truth. He had believed that his dominance was permanent, but the storm I had nurtured over years of suffering was finally upon him, and he could not escape it. And in that moment, as he faced the woman he had underestimated for so long, I understood that survival had been only the beginning, endurance had been only the foundation, and the reckoning I had orchestrated was the ultimate manifestation of everything I had endured, every tear I had shed, every humiliation I had suffered, and every night I had spent plotting silently. I had become unstoppable, unshakable, undeniable, and the woman he thought he had broken was now the force that could shatter his entire world. And he knew it. Every flicker of his eyes, every falter in his voice, every hesitation in his movements told me that he understood, finally, that he could no longer dominate, no longer intimidate, no longer hurt. I had risen fully, completely, and he was powerless to stop me. The weight of years of cruelty crashed down on him, and I stood taller than ever, a storm he could not withstand, a reckoning he could not evade, a woman reborn from pain, empowered by betrayal and unstoppable in her pursuit of justice. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, yet it carried the weight of every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of silent suffering I had endured. He did not notice me at first, standing there calm, composed, my gaze steady, my heart no longer trembling. For years, he had thrived on my fear, my silence, my submission, but today nothing about me belonged to him. The woman he thought he had broken had risen fully, fiercer than he could imagine, stronger than any manipulation could ever hold. I began to speak, my voice resonating with years of buried anguish, every word laced with the clarity of someone who had survived the impossible. I told him about the nights I cried alone, about the countless times I swallowed my voice, about the moments when his arrogance made me feel invisible. I recounted every insult, every humiliation, every manipulation, not with hatred but with a precision that left him speechless, staring at me as if for the first time, realizing that the girl he had underestimated was no longer the same. My words were not just a confession. They were a reckoning, an unveiling of every scar he had left on my soul, every wound he believed invisible, every mark he had carved in silence. I could see the shock in his eyes, the disbelief, the sudden panic, the helplessness that only comes when someone realizes the power they thought they held has completely slipped away. I had watched him carefully for years, studying every movement, every expression, every weakness, and now the culmination of that patience, that strategy, that strength, revealed itself in full force. I saw him falter under the weight of truth, the burden of guilt, the reflection of his own cruelty magnified through my resilience. And as I continued, I felt the release of every chained emotion, the liberation of every suppressed tear, the empowerment of every moment he had tried to dominate me. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer small. I was no longer defined by his actions. I was the woman who had endured, who had observed, who had calculated, who had transformed suffering into power. And as he stared, powerless, I realized that the revenge I had sought was not chaos, not destruction, but the revelation of truth, the undeniable exposure of everything he had taken for granted. The man who thought he controlled me now understood that the control had always been an illusion, that every attempt to dominate had only prepared me for this moment, that every wound inflicted was a spark that had set me ablaze with resolve. And in that room, filled with years of pain and silent endurance, I felt the ultimate liberation. I felt my strength crystallize, my voice sharpen, my presence command. And I knew that the girl who had once cried herself to sleep while he smiled had vanished completely. She had been replaced by someone unstoppable, unshakable, and unbreakable. And as he sank into the realization of his failure, I allowed myself a quiet smile, not for revenge, not for malice, but for the undeniable truth that I had survived, that I had risen, that I had claimed my own life back from the shadow of his cruelty. I had spoken for the girl he ignored, for the woman he belittled, for the soul he thought he could destroy. And in that moment, I understood the power of endurance, the force of clarity, the inevitability of justice when patience and courage meet. He would remember me, not as a girl who loved him, not as a woman he could break, but as a storm that arrived quietly, fiercely, and without warning, and that storm had no intention of sparing him. The world would not forget my rise, my voice, my strength, and neither would he. And as I walked away, finally free, finally unshackled, finally whole, I whispered to myself, a single line that carried the weight of everything I had endured, everything I had overcome, everything I had become. Never underestimate the power of a woman who has survived.